Invite you to turn in your Bible to the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 16. 1 Corinthians 16. While you're doing that, and before we get the lesson started this evening, I'd like to let you in on a plan that Donald and I have in terms of trying to find ways to be more proper shepherds over the flock. I think you believe this, and we certainly believe this, that the job of a shepherd is to look over the souls of the sheep. And that's a lot more than the idea of just watching over a budget or, getting caught up in various material projects. And as a part of that effort, we decided we're going to try something we hope will be helpful to us in that regard. We don't have a schedule, but what we would like to do is to sit down with every family and to, in turn, talk about a few questions or points that we want you to have a chance to think about, pray about before we sit down. Understand this is not going to be an effort to try to grill somebody or to hurt anybody. But it's hopefully an effort for us to, as shepherds of the flock here, to make a very personal connection and to talk with each member here about issues like where do you see yourself spiritually, and what areas do you feel need to be strengthened, and how can the congregation here, the elders here, help in that journey, and how do you believe you can best serve or serve better the congregation, the Lord here in this congregation. And so if you didn't get all that down, we'll try to write that down so you'll have a chance to think about those questions. But we hope those are relevant questions, and the effort is strictly to try to be more of a help in the work that God has given us, which is to encourage spiritual growth and development. And we'll talk about the logistics of all of that, whether we meet here at the building after service or meet at your house or our house or whatever it might be. We'll talk about that. But finding a time convenient and sitting down and for a few minutes thinking about those very relevant questions, that'll be our hope and our aim. We'll talk about that more later, but just wanted to make folks aware of that, and we'll try to make it easy for you to prepare ahead of time mentally and spiritually, pray about those things, and we'll hope to be able to have some beneficial conversations about that in the near future. Donald and I were talking about that. It'd take quite a while if you just got one family a week. I don't know if we'll keep that pace or not, but it'd take a little while to get through the list, even as small as we are. So we're not in a rush about this, but we certainly hope that will be a help to all of us in terms of our spiritual growth. Okay, we're continuing the last stages of our study from 1 Corinthians. And last time we were talking about this, we began some thoughts about 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. And if it be meet that I go also, they shall go with me. That's how this section begins. We looked in a previous lesson about some of the things that we are taught here. We certainly learned about the collection for the saints. The collection We're talking about taking up a collection. The purpose of this collection is not a private thing, by the way. This is something the church did when they came together on the first day of the week. This was the practice, not just at Corinth. He said, as I've given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. So here's the practice of the early church, how they raised funds. We made the point that what you have here, I think, is the exclusive pattern of how the church raised funds in the first century. The only way we have that's authorized in the Bible for a church to collect funds. Now, particularly here, this particular collection was going to be used for the purpose of the helping of needy saints out of the treasury, the store. That's the word, treasury. And here you have a collection, a gathering. Again, not a private matter, but Paul said, let it be gathered on the first day of the week. I'm instructing the churches in this regard, not just individuals, but the church to collect funds that individuals would give, and that that would eliminate the need for gathering or a collecting when I come for this purpose. They would, on the first day of the week, give to fund the work of the church. But this particular work would already be funded by the time he got there. There'd be no special need to gather funds for this purpose. What was the purpose? It was the helping of needy saints. So we talked about those issues last time, and we'll not re-preach that. But I think those are very instructive, very important from the example at Corinth, the approved example. What I want to notice with you starting tonight was another statement made in verse 2. On the first day of the week, let everyone, that would include every child of God that has an income. And so this is instruction for those, no matter what age or gender, every one of you lay by him in store as God hath prospered him. And so here you see a remark that tells us concerning the way in which individuals are to give and think about their giving. As God has prospered us. We might see that as quite different from the Old Testament, from the law of Moses, where you find instruction, of course, giving concerning tithing, giving the first tenth of your income to God. I might just make this point. When you read the Old Testament instruction about tithing, and that's a study that really goes beyond what we're going to try to do tonight, but we'll give one example in the book of Leviticus, chapter 27. Beginning in verse 30, Moses gave this instruction. 1/10 of all the produce of the land, whether grain or fruit, belongs to the Lord. If you wish to buy back any of it, you must pay the standard price plus an additional 20%. Give a fifth. Now, he says in verse 32, 1 of every 10 domestic animals belongs to the Lord. When the animals are counted, every 10th one belongs to the Lord. You may not arrange the animals so that the poor animals are chosen. You may not make any substitutions. If you substitute one animal for another, both animals belong to the Lord and may not be bought back. So that gives you a sampling of what tithing was about. Giving to God. But I'll mention this to you as well. Brother Walden, in his material, I'm quoting from Brother Walden here, makes the point that in addition to the congregational and individual sacrifices required, people were commanded to give 1/10 of their increase, as we just read. But I think he makes a good point there, that there was other giving that was done besides the tithing, the giving of 1/10 of their produce and of their livestock. This didn't include, for example, a free will offering that they might give, or a sin offering that they might bring, and so on. So that's more in addition to what we're talking about. Also, if we read the law correctly, I think, what we'll find is there was more than one tithe. Brother Walden continues, the Israelites were to make a second tithe of the produce of the soil. And go back to Deuteronomy 14, and for various reasons, it's obvious this is not the tithe that we're talking about in Leviticus 27. It's an additional tithe. It's 1/10 of the 9 parts of what remained that was to be given. And every third year, some have argued this was a third tithe. Maybe it was that second tithe redirected. But every third year, this tithe was to be taken to the sanctuary, to the gates, for the poor to receive. Normally, the tithe would be strictly for the Levite. But the point is, when you think about tithing, it wasn't just a clean 10%. It was 10% plus that those folks gave when they did properly. And sometimes people will say, well, you know, we're not under a tithe under the New Testament law. And you wonder whether they're saying that in the sense to say we can give less, or that it would be good to give less. And they don't even realize all that was given, perhaps, under the old law. Now, we don't have a percentage given. That is true. What we have is another statement written to the Corinthians that I think speaks to us very plainly. I'm referring now to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 6. Paul says, this is a modern translation. It reads, "Remember this, a person who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And one who sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you must give what you have decided in your heart, not with regret or under compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver." We don't have a percentage in this passage, but as the old translation says, we have a comparison between sowing sparingly and reaping sparingly, sowing bountifully and reaping bountifully. We know what it means to sow sparingly, to sow cheaply, to sow just a little, you reap just a little. But God said when you sow a lot, you reap a lot. Bountifully is the word here. And it's a word literally that means upon blessing. Eulogia, the word we get eulogy. You know, when you have a funeral, that's where we use the word, and a fellow comes and he tries to say all he can think of that's good about a fellow that's passed on. And so apply that now to the idea of giving or sowing. And it's the idea of that which is a blessing, an abundant blessing, poured out. The more you give in that sense, the more you receive. Not the old wealth and health gospel of, hey, I'm going to send this fellow on TV $100 and God will give me 1,000. That's not what we're talking about. We understand exactly what he's saying here. He's saying, don't be cheap with God because you can't outgive God. And it's the right thing to do. I very much appreciated the point that Gable made today in his lesson about that. I hope to say something along that line, but since he did, I won't have to. But I certainly hope that we don't think of our giving as being just some sort of a sacrifice. What did he say here? He said, not with regret or under compulsion, but as a privilege. That what I'm doing in this is I'm having a part in God's work, and I'm having fellowship, for example, with those who might teach the gospel. To use this in order to help spread the gospel, to help perhaps needy brethren. That's what I'm doing. And it's a privilege to be able to do that. You think the widow who went to the temple and gave the whole of her living, and Jesus, knowing her story, praised her for that before the disciples. You think that she did that because she felt forced to? I think she thought it was a privilege. It was an act of faith, and it was also an act of humility and an act of service. When I think about this subject, and by the way, folks who've been here a long time know this is not a subject I've talked about a lot through the years. Maybe I haven't talked about it enough. I was sort of influenced by an old preacher years ago, and his philosophy was, you know, if you just teach people to give themselves to God, you won't have to say much about giving. The rest of it comes sort of natural. And maybe that's so. There's something about this subject that when a fellow gets up like me and talks about it, it sounds self-serving. I assure you it's not. I think, again, I'll just appeal to you guys who've known me for years. I think you would know that I'm not a fellow who's about money. I've been well blessed, and I've got all I need and more, so I'm not whining about anything. I've not lacked. But that's never been an ambition of mine. And so I'm not here in any self-interest trying to get something. But rather I'm talking about a responsibility that all of us have, whoever we are as children of God. And I think it is good once in a while just to stop and question ourselves. There's a story I may have told you, forgive me if I have. But I heard it years ago. I can't remember where. I'd give them credit if I did. But it somehow stuck with me. A silly little story about olden days, about a young man, a little boy really, whose parents were in the habit of giving him every Saturday 2 nickels, back when a nickel was something. You know, you could take that nickel and go down to the candy store and buy 5 pieces of penny candy. You impressed with my math? That's right. 5, that's a lot of candy for a little kid. So he'd get his nickel. And he also got a second nickel to put into the collection plate the next day. You may have heard this story. But as it goes, the young man this particular Saturday morning couldn't wait, heading down to the candy store. And as a young man will do, maybe wanted to look at his reward. He reached into his pocket as he's walking down the street there in the little town, pulls it out, and as he pulls out this nickel, the second nickel fell out of his pocket, and as it always happens, rolled straight down the gutter and down the drain. Heartache. So he walked over, no chance to retrieve it. And he looked down that drain, and he looked in his hand, and he looked down the drain. And as the story goes, he said in a voice that could be heard, "Lord, there goes your nickel." And the point of that old story is simply this, that a lot of people who have a lot less excuse than this young man tend to think of their stuff that way, my stuff. And whatever I give to the Lord, you know, that's really subject to what happens to my stuff. The way I count my budget is, if everything goes just right, and I get all my bills paid, and I get all the stuff I want, and I take care of all the stuff that I have, that whatever's left from all that we'll talk to the Lord about. And as it turns out, I just got $2 left, and surely I need one of those just in case. And that's how we determine our giving. Maybe it's not that extreme, but it's not far from that, maybe in some cases. Let me make this point as well. I have no earthly idea. I have a lot of confidence in the folks I'm talking to here, but I have never made it my practice or purpose to find out what somebody else does or don't do. They don't even let me count the money around here. That's not true. I don't have that service. But so I'm not talking about something, that owns some sort of secret information. That's between you and the Lord. You don't know what I give, maybe. That's between me and the Lord. I'm just talking to all of us as Christians, and I'm asking the question, are we giving bountifully? Young and old. It's not about the amount. You've seen these charts. I think there is some use for them. I didn't originate this. I borrowed it from somewhere. And it's very small print, I recognize. But you know what's going on here. Somebody here is trying to give us an idea of what percentage we do give. And so this chart is set up where on one side you have the annual income from $10,000 at the bottom a year to $300,000 a year. And then you have across the top the percentage from that income that would be represented by X amount of monthly giving. This is not weekly, but monthly giving. And so that's the way this chart is set up. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but the point of it is that it's not the amount necessarily, but it's the percentage of what we're giving, what we're giving of our income, that really might be the tale here. And somebody might be blessed with a larger income, and they might give what seems like a large number. But when you begin to really look at it, what you recognize is that they may be given just 3 or 4% of their income. It's a lot larger than this fellow over here, but this fellow over here who has a lot smaller income may be giving a lot more in relative terms. The question for you and me is, where do we stand on this scale? If I begin to look at that and apply that personally, and it's not your business or mine, but just each of us looking at ourselves, we would say, I didn't realize I was given just that much. Maybe there would be some who would say, well, I'm giving more than I thought, percentage-wise, but then they likely wouldn't say, I'm giving too much. He that sows sparingly shall reap sparingly. He that sows bountifully shall reap bountifully. And I think it's important for us as Christians, as a part of our service, to sit down and think about whether or not we are doing the Lord right in the support of His work. Well, we don't have to give 10%. How blessed are we in comparison even with those who knew the Lord back under the old covenant? But we may not be giving near as much as they were percentage-wise. Each of us will have to stand before God based upon how we live in every area, including this one. He that sows sparingly shall reap sparingly. He that sows bountifully shall reap bountifully. And God forbid if I'm so foolish as to look at life and think, Lord, there goes your nickel. Let me put first things first, always. Let me suggest something else that we learn, I think, from Paul's words here as he's closing this letter out that relates to this subject. We learned about the timing. We learned about the means by which we learned about at least part of what the money was used for. We learned that we are to give as we have prospered, each one of us. We also, I think, learned the lesson that we might summarize with the words, handle with care. Because there's something about that also in our text, isn't there? Going back to 1 Corinthians 16, Paul writes in verse 3, and when I come, I don't know why I put a space in there as an accident. And when I come, whosoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. And if it be meet that I go also, they shall go with me. What's going on here? Paul, in this case, is taking money from these various churches, from their collections that were gathered, the treasury gathered on the first day of the week, and taking a part of that treasury, and he was going to take that to Jerusalem, or at least make sure that it was sent there. Ultimately, he would take it there. But he wasn't going to take that money by himself. He was going to make sure that there were people from these churches that were selected by them who would go with this money and hopefully go with him with this money. And why would he do that? He would do that, I believe, in order to make sure that everything was above question in terms of honesty and in terms of expediency. When he wrote the letter we call 2 Corinthians, chapter 8, about the same matter, he writes there in verse 19, in addition, this brother has also been chosen by the churches as our traveling companion. I'm not sure who that brother was. They knew. But he's a man also chosen, not by Paul, but by others, those who were giving. As we administer this generous gift to the glory of the Lord Himself and to show our readiness to help, we did this as a precaution so that no one could blame us or should blame us in regard to this generous gift we are administering. For we are concerned about what is right not only before God, for the Lord, but also before men. One modern speech translation on that last part reads, so that no man might be able to say anything against us in this business of this giving, which has been put into our hands. For the business has been so ordered by us as to have the approval not only of the Lord, but also of men. So here's a point I think we can learn in passing that Paul teaches us here. Some divine wisdom. That it not only matters what's right, it matters how things look. I'm going to say this just because I believe it and I think this is true. In the years that I've been here, we've had men who have served as treasurers, for example, those who handle the business generally. You've got to have somebody who's responsible and trustworthy in that position. We've been blessed that way. Brother Chris has handled this for years. It is, generally speaking, sadly, a very thankless job, and it's a hard job. Now, if you're good at it, maybe you can get quicker at it, but it takes time. It's a service. But as I said, you have to have those in that position who are people that you can trust. I remember a case, a congregation in another state, and good people, good congregation. They had a young man there who was just filled with confidence, and he just said, you know, look, I can do the treasury. I'll serve in that regard. And the brethren, after some deliberation, decided yes, he could do that. Now the young man, an honest young man, but he was not well suited to that job. And before long, it was a situation where there were some problems, let's say, with the treasury. And he was so upset about the matter that he went and talked to an older brother there and said, look, I got a problem. I don't know how to fix this. And he and some other brethren sat down and worked through trying to find a way to make things balanced, to figure out where the mistakes were, and to make it so that people knew he hadn't put money in his pocket or given money away unjustly. It was just some mistakes that were made. The point is, he was willing, but he wasn't really ready for such a job as that. Paul is saying here, we want to make sure that we handle this money in such a way that we are above reproach, and that it's not just one person that has access to this. And we don't want that to be the case here. It never has been the case here. There are records kept. They can be examined. They are examined. This is what wisdom would dictate in reference to handling funds generally. When I was working secular work as a young man, I knew what a CEO was. I knew what a manager was. I knew what an assistant manager was. But man, I'm from Pleasant Grove. I didn't know what a comptroller was. I'd never heard that. I thought they were mispronouncing controller. But I found out pretty quick what that was. That was a guy, he wasn't just a fellow that walked down the hall in a tie. He was a fellow who had a pretty heavy responsibility. He was looking over all the books. He was looking over all the accounting. And if you're the owner, you better have a fellow like that you can trust. He's important. And that's true generally. When it comes to the Lord's stuff, we have to be careful. And we have to be above board in terms of honesty. And I think that was Paul's view there. Okay. Let's move on back in our text in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And I think in this section we find something about Paul's immediate plans as he shares them with the Corinthians. Remember, Paul is in Ephesus when he's writing this letter and sending it over to the church at Corinth. And he writes as he begins to close this letter, "Now I will come unto you when I pass through Macedonia. For I do pass through Macedonia, and it may be that I will abide, yea, and winter with you, that ye may bring me on my journey whithersoever I go. For I will not see you now, by the way, but I trust to tarry a while with you, if the Lord permit. But I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost. For, he says, a great door and effectual, powerful, is open unto me, and there are many adversaries." That's a great line, isn't it? Open doors and adversaries. But when you read the book of Acts, you can see Luke's historical account of these very things Paul's talking about. Paul was at Ephesus. I don't know which way to point now. I ought to use that clicker. Chris tried to set me up on that, and I didn't get it done. But anyway, you know where Ephesus is. It's over here on the coast of Asia Minor, as we call it. And he's writing the letter over to the Corinthians from here. He says, I plan to go over and spend some time in Macedonia and then come down to Corinth to be with you. And that was the plan. And so when you read the book of Acts, when the uproar was over, we know what that's about. The followers of Artemis in Ephesus created such a fuss and such a threat to Paul's life that he was actually sent away out of town. And so that hastened his departing the city. And when the uproar was over, Paul sent for the disciples and encouraged them, said goodbye, and left for Macedonia. And he went through that region and spoke many words of encouragement to the people. And then he went to Greece. I think it's fair to suggest that Greece here, as was used by Luke, refers to this lower province. We call it also Achaia. And likely, from Paul's plans, it was at Corinth that he would have stayed. And stayed there for 3 months. And when Paul was going to board a ship for Syria, he found out that the Jews were plotting to kill him, so he decided to go back through Macedonia. Instead of going by sea down to Jerusalem, he went back north the way he came. Came over the Aegean that's when he stopped at this little place that we know as Miletus, where he met with the Ephesian elders, somewhere here. I think it's marked on this map. Yeah, marked right here on this map. And then made his way down to Jerusalem. That's the end of the third journey. And that's when Paul goes to Jerusalem and is arrested in the temple and begins several years of incarceration in Judea, in Syria, and then over in Rome, finally. And that's where the book of Acts ends. Anyway, this is all a part of the story, a part of the history. So Paul is writing this letter, and he has his plan. He plans to come to them, but not now. Why not now? Why doesn't Paul just leave where he's at and go over there and deal with these problems? Seems logical to me. Why did he do that? Well, I think we can learn a couple of things reading what Paul says here. In the first place, his decision about when to go was certainly affected by the work he was doing at that time. Again, remember what he said there in verse 9. This is a modern speech translation. He said, in explaining his movement, he said, because there is a wonderful opportunity for me to do some work here. Here was Ephesus. But there are also many people who are against me. When you think about Paul's work at Ephesus, it would be a mistake, wouldn't it, to just think about how it ended, to think about the uproar and it being chased out of town sort of by these very radical individuals. I think it might be a little early to call them woke, but they were in a measure. And so he was chased out of town. But you know, back in Acts, we learned that that was at the end of a 3-year stay. Now, as good Bible students, you know, how many places did Paul ever stay for 3 years? That wasn't Paul's work. Nothing wrong with staying 3 years or more. But Paul's work was on the frontier. Paul's work was in going and starting churches, taking the gospel maybe where it had not been before. That was the work that he chose, that God chose maybe for him. And so to be 3 years at Ephesus would suggest there was a lot of things that were good that were going on. In fact, that's backed up by what we read in Acts 19. In Acts 19 in verse 9 beginning, but when some were stubborn and refused to believe, reviling the way before the congregation, he left them and took the disciples with him, addressing them every day in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. This went on for 2 years, so that all who lived in the province of Asia, both Jews and Greeks, heard the word of the Lord. Remember this, that Paul's work in Ephesus didn't just help the Ephesians, it helped the whole region. His work there spread out like a wave throughout that whole section. And so when you read about churches springing up around Ephesus, many of them, you can be pretty sure, were started from Paul's efforts there. We may not read about those works starting. We read about Ephesus, and maybe that is the start of those works in one sense. In Acts 19 and verse 25, when Demetrius and this crowd of enemies of God made their voice known, they charged Paul this way, and it's very telling what he said. He gathered together the workmen in similar trade, these people who made idols for a living, and he said, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away a great many people. That's a very telling statement from a hostile witness of the effect of Paul's work. So here's Paul, and he is he's right, certainly, when he talked. Wasn't just dreaming when he said there are many opportunities here. But there were certainly adversaries as well. And those adversaries had their effect, and Paul did have to leave. But even then, he did not go straight to Corinth, did he? He went through Macedonia, and in fact stayed in Macedonia for a time. So we still have the question, why didn't Paul just go over there? He said, I'm not going to come to you right away. Why? Well, in part, I think it might also be based on the situation at Corinth. We learned that, I think, from the letter we call 2 Corinthians. At the end, or near the end of that letter, 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 20, Paul wrote, I am afraid that when I get there, I will find you different from what I would like you to be, and you will find me different from what you would like me to be. I think we understand what he's saying there. We know the troubled nature of the church at Corinth. We understand the problems they were having. And we also understand by reading 2 Corinthians that some of them were fixed, some of them may not have been yet fixed. And so Paul, instead of going there, writes the second letter, we call it, and he says, I'm still not sure you want me to be there yet. And we understand what he meant. Let me go ahead and read the rest of this passage. He says, I'm afraid that I will find quarreling and jealousy and hot tempers and selfishness and insults and gossip and pride and disorder. And I am afraid that next time I come, my God will humiliate me in your presence, and I shall weep over many who sinned in the past and who have not repented of the immoral things they've done, their lust and their sexual sins. You know, it is to me one of the great challenges as a Christian, as a brother in Christ, much less a shepherd. It's a difficult thing to me to know always with certainty when's the time to charge and when's the time to give room. There certainly is a time to charge. There's a time, you know, the Lord in Matthew 23 just peeled all the bark off when he said, you know, you go out here compassing sea and land to make a proselyte, and when you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourself. What hope is there for you? You know, but you know, Jesus didn't go up to everybody like that. And there were times when he would approach things very differently. I don't think he ever changed his attitude towards sin, but I think Jesus, having all wisdom, knew when to push and when to pull back, when to give room and when to give no room. And I think that's a challenge for all of us who have the heart to try to share the message. We want to help others. We don't always know with certainty or trust our judgment completely to make sure that we're not letting some ego get involved in this somehow, or that too much of us might be involved in some things. So it's just interesting to me, the Apostle Paul, who was certainly a man of great courage and boldness, and who wrote this letter, more than one letter to these brethren, said, I still don't think you want me to be there right now. I want to give you more time to meditate on what you're doing where you are before we have this meeting face to face. That didn't make Paul any less bold. It was an example of him using wisdom. And all of us will have to pray God's wisdom in that regard. When's the time to push? When's the time to give some room for thought, meditation, and growth? But I just find that interesting. I think one of the reasons why Paul didn't go immediately was because of what was going on at Ephesus, and part of it was going on at Corinth. But something else that he mentions here as an overlying factor in all of this was what he said in verse 7. He said, I hope to spend some time with you. It was in his plan eventually to go to Corinth. He said, if the Lord permits me. And doesn't that sound a lot like, James chapter 4? If the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. We have to always give God his place. This is a lesson I have tried to learn for years, and I'm still trying to learn it. But I do believe that for many of us, the frustrations that we find in life, if we're unwise enough to allow those frustrations to attack us and to beat us down, might be wiped away and avoided completely if we just remembered this simple point, that my life is not my life, that my time is not my time, that I can make a plan and be well, but the Lord ultimately is the one who decides. And he's the one that will give me tomorrow or not, and he may close a door that I thought I was going to use. Yield to him. But it certainly won't be a matter that ruins my day or even my hour if I come to realize that my time, my wisdom is just not the way I look at my life. That my life ultimately is a gift of God, and I have got to learn patience that way. We're going to face disappointments. I'm not silly. But it will not become an aggravation to me if I come to realize that simple point. Paul said, I've got plans, and these are things I really would like to do. But I think he was doing more than just talking when he said, if the Lord permit me. Hey, maybe one day I'll learn that lesson. I'm trying. And if you hear me say otherwise, remind me. Whose life do you think it is anyway? Who's in charge anyway? Okay, I think we have just a couple of minutes. Just a couple of minutes, and then we'll pause again. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 10, beginning, we have this little section where Paul talks about two men, and we'll talk about one of them, then we'll quit. Paul writes, continuing his thought here, now if Timothy come, see that he may be with you without fear, for he works for the Lord as I also do. Let no man therefore despise him, but conduct him forth in peace, that he may come unto me, for I look for him with the brethren. Again, the book of Acts gives us the background here in verse 21 of Acts 19. Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent unto Macedonia two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. That's exactly what Paul said. He said, I'm going to be here for a while, but I'm going to send over ahead of me Timothy and another man, but Timothy. So he writes to the Corinthians and he says, Timothy, expect him to come if it's possible. You know, we have to praise Timothy in the first place for being willing to go to a place like Corinth, problemed and troubled as it was. It wouldn't be necessarily a work that you covet, I think, with all the problems that they had. But you know, that was the kind of guy Timothy was. We've looked before, even recently, I think, in Philippians chapter 2. You know, Timothy was a servant of the Lord, and Paul made use of him in various places. He was at Ephesus when Paul wrote to him. He's heading to Corinth and to Macedonia first. But you know, when Paul wrote to the church at Philippi, a place in Macedonia, you remember what Paul wrote there to those brethren concerning Timothy. Verse 19 of Philippians chapter 2. I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timotheus shortly unto you, that I may be of good comfort when I know of your state. For I have no man like-minded who will naturally care for your state. All seek their own, and not the things which are Jesus Christ, but you know the proof of him, that as a son with the Father, he hath served with me in the gospel. That's the kind of man he was. And wherever the need was, Timothy was willing to go. And we ought to remember that, and I think appreciate and learn from that. There's something else that he says here about Timothy that we can't help but notice quickly, and that is he says, I don't want you to despise him. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? We learned from 1 Timothy chapter 4. Paul wrote something in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12, something that sounds similar to that, but it's directed differently perhaps. In 1 Timothy 4, we all remember verse 12, where Paul writes to Timothy, let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity. Shall I come, give attention to reading and to exhortation and to doctrine. Neglect not the gift that's in thee, and so on. What's interesting is that Paul writes to Timothy, now I think he was probably talking about Ephesus, but he writes to Timothy in general terms. He says, don't let people despise your youth. One reason people despise an individual, to think down on them literally, is because they might be young, Or it could work the other way. It could be that they're old. Or it could be they're from the wrong place. Or it could be that they're from, they talk with a wrong accent. But what he said is, don't let people look down on you. Well, how do I stop that? Well, you just get up there in the middle of the road and you just say, look, you people got to stop despising me. No, that's not what he said. He said, don't act entitled, but earn people's respect. That's what he's saying, isn't it? I think that's great advice for every young person here. A point we've made before, we hope to make again. You know, young people, we all want respect. Even young people want respect. Here's what Paul would say to us. Earn respect. Let your conduct be such that people will see you're not just like some of the silly young people, but you have a different heart. You have a different goal. You have a different standard. Let that be your guiding principle. Let no man despise thy youth. But he writes in this passage, this is William's translation, and he writes to the Corinthians in this case, and he says, if Timothy gets there, see that he's at ease among you, so that, he is devotedly doing the work of the Lord just as I am, so no one must slight him at all. Let no man despise him, as the other translation would say. The key is, Paul said, you've got to recognize he's doing the work just like I am. He's a fellow servant, a fellow helper, a co-worker with me. So when he writes to Timothy, he says, earn respect. Don't walk around with an entitled attitude. If skepticism comes, let it come. In time, you'll prove yourself. Give it time. Put in the work. When he writes to the church, he says, if you have any respect for me, respect him. There's no room for entitlement, and there's no room for prejudice, I should say. And a sense of, well, I know him. You don't know him until you meet him, until you see him, until you talk to them. So it's a great picture, it seems to me, and a good practical lesson about how to deal with people from both directions. Okay, it's 6 o'clock. We got another lesson study tonight, so I don't need to go any more. We'll talk about the rest of this passage, Lord willing, soon. I appreciate always your kind attention, and hope that some of these things have been useful to you. Please get out your songbooks if you haven't already and turn to the number that's been selected. And we invite you tonight, if you desire to obey the gospel of Christ and to be baptized into Christ, that you would make that decision tonight. This is a time you have, and what a great and important time it is. If you're here as one who is a child of God, but you've not been faithful to the promises you've made, why not tonight turn back to God. Let him know. Let the brethren know, if need be. And he longs to receive you. We'd be glad to help you. If we might assist you in any way, please come right now as we stand and as we sing.